Hey friends, Liz here. June 24th marks the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, the 2022 Supreme Court ruling which ended the federal abortion protections of Roe v. Wade. On this special episode of Feminist Buzzkills, we're looking at the fall of Roe and just how far we've fallen. It has been 3 years since that fateful day, and a lot has happened. It's dark, but people are not backing down. In fact, they're fighting back harder than ever. States are protecting abortion access like never before. Providers and advocates are suing to protect abortion access, and the public is waking up and stepping up to fight back. I sat down just days after the horrific events in Minnesota with two incredible movement leaders who happen to be Abortion Access Front board members who have been on the front lines in this fight. Dr. Michele Goodwin, who will join the conversation in a few minutes, is a constitutional law professor at Georgetown University, a reproductive justice scholar, author, and host of the Ms. Magazine podcast on the issues. But first, we're going to open up the conversation with Amy Hagstrom Miller, an independent abortion provider who has provided care in states like Texas and Indiana, fought legal battles in these states long before the fall of Roe, as well as currently providing care in states like Minnesota, New Mexico, and Virginia. Amy is a provider who can truly bring the full picture of navigating providing care in hostile states, pro-abortion states, while simultaneously suing bad guys. Please welcome Amy Hagstrom Miller. Amy, I'm so grateful to have you here.
Thank you. It's really good to be with another Minnesotan.
It would be remiss to not open this episode without talking about the recent events that happened in Minnesota. You're from here. You have a clinic in a suburb of Minneapolis, and you and your staff went through a lot of fear and uncertainty on the day that this madman murdered two Minnesota politicians and had a hit list that included abortion providers and advocates. So what I haven't seen yet again, abortion providers who went through that being centered in this coverage. So I'm wondering if you can walk our listeners through that day and share your perspective of what you and your staff and other providers were going through.
Yes, thanks, Liz, for letting me tell the story. So on Saturday morning, I actually got a text message from a friend, from an ally, someone who's actually on our board, who let me know that some kind of hit list and manifesto was discovered and that he also had abortion providers on his list. And I have a clinic in Bloomington, Minnesota, and we were open at that moment. And we had patients on site, staff on site, our provider was there, and we knew that this hitman was on the loose, and we had no idea who he was. If he was one of the, convicted felons who was convicted with the FACE Act that, Trump pardoned earlier this year, or, where he was driving around to, if he had our clinic on his list, if he had any of our staff or providers on his list. It was terrifying. So first, reached out to the clinic manager and just sort of let them know what was happening and let the clinic staff really decide, how best we could support them. And so we just had a few patients left to see that day. And so the staff really wanted to go ahead as normal, see the patients, get the patients cared for, and try to get themselves out of the clinic as efficiently as possible. We hadn't heard anything from law enforcement. Liz, I actually still haven't heard anything from any law enforcement. FBI, PD, nobody has reached out to anyone at Whole Woman's Health at this point to let us know who was on the list, who wasn't, whether we were, whether we weren't. So I still have this uncertainty even 3 days later, assuming we weren't listed, but really not sure, who was and what the outcome is. We reached out proactively to Bloomington Police Department. We have a good relationship with them. We had formed that relationship early on and asked for them to come to the clinic and escort the staff to their cars and be sure that everybody was able to leave safely. Because here again, we had no idea if this person was coming for our clinic next, or if they might be, in the parking lot or something. Staff were incredible. I reached out to the doctor who was on site that day, and they said, there's nowhere I'd rather be today. And there's no one I'd rather be with than the staff team today. And closed the clinic. And then all day Sunday, we also were just navigating this uncertainty, really no idea if our doctors, our staff, me, anybody was listed on this list or not, but heard through the grapevine that there were, if you were on the list, you would have been contacted by now. Was sort of what I heard, but it doesn't really make you exhale, I had heard through the grapevine that the people on the list were given protection, which is great. I didn't really know what that meant or what that looked like, but, was trying to just sort of assume at that point that Whole Woman's Health and our team were safe. We did ask the Bloomington police to come in on Monday morning and sweep the clinic just before any staff went into the building to be sure that nothing looked funny and that everything was safe. And of course, when I found out that the assassin had been caught on Sunday night, which we now know was by a woman, Wendy, who saw him in a field. First person I texted was the clinic manager, and the second person I texted was the doctor, just to say, hey, they got him. And this whole time, we've all just been worried about, who's on the loose. And this is how terrorism works.
Yes.
Yesterday, I spent quite a bit of time talking to reporters from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune to the 19th to the New York Times. And I found a few things. One, I found that after telling the story a few different times about the history of anti-abortion violence, I myself wasn't doing very well. It was really triggering for me. It was really sort of hard to talk about. It was also hard. There was one reporter who was kind of new to the abortion beat, and that was pretty exhausting for me to really sort of lay out the history here and what's at stake. And oftentimes people describe protesters in abortion as though it's something we should expect, or anti-abortion terrorism as something, oh, well, that's normalized. It's part of your work. You've been dealing with this for a long time, but an elected official, for them, it's new or whatever. And I find myself really trying to redirect a lot of these reporters to say, these protesters aren't my protesters. I'm not going to take possession of them with my pronouns, right? These protesters belong to the community, and they are protesting us as providers. They're protesting the people in the community coming for abortion care who we're trying to serve. These protesters belong to all of us. And the permission we have given anti-abortion people to wreak havoc in domestic terrorism for decades is something all of us in our communities are participating in, that permission. And we're saying somehow that because we're abortion providers, we should expect this or it's okay. And it is not okay. And terrorism works in this way where you're not sure who it is. You're not sure when they're going to come next. You're not sure if you're in the clear or not. I think if the law enforcement who are involved in this case in Minnesota have done a remarkable job catching him. But one thing I'd like to have as a takeaway afterward is to sort of give them context of what it is like to be an abortion provider and have them know that we all needed a phone call to tell us we weren't on the list.
Yes.
Because every one of us has been on high alert for days, and not just in Minnesota, across the country. I'm hearing from all of my provider friends just worried. And it happened in Minnesota, in a place where people always think, oh, that's not going to happen in a place like this. This kind of stuff happens in Texas or in Mississippi or Louisiana or Indiana. This doesn't happen in this place, right? And I think it's really been hard. And even at this moment, I still haven't heard from anybody official.
I had to say, that was my whole thing. You and I were texting throughout that time. And to the point that you made that everyone deserves a call. There are 5 abortion providers in this state, I believe.
There's only 4 clinics left. Planned Parenthood and 3 indies.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Duluth, Fargo, and you, and Planned Parenthood. Those people deserve calls. And also, I think it's important for our listeners here to know that abortion providers are on many lists. This is the list of this event. And an abortion provider is on lists that are unknown to us, known to us. Oftentimes, you have people who are contacting you to say, we've had alert. So that lack of education when it comes to enforcement is important. Also important to remember that we have such short memories, and Operation Rescue set up their training facilities in Minnesota in the late 1980s. And the Minnesota government allowed this person he would sleep in jail and he got a work furlough, and his job was to go out and torture and train clinics. So the history of violence and the history of anti-abortion violence also has roots in Minnesota in a way that the media needs to educate themselves, activists need to educate themselves, and people need to really fundamentally understand that anti-abortion terrorism is not in a vacuum. As you said, we own this, but they are also part of the Proud Boys. They are also part of extremist white supremacist churches. They are also part of the January 6th insurrection. They were there, right? And so we are often marginalized and siloed. And that's just another way that our lives have been, or your life even more. As an advocate, I feel it, but it's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Need to be centered. And you've also been through this before as a provider. You have, as a person in Minnesota, experienced a clinic invasion.
Yeah. One of the clinics I started working at, as a young person at 21 in Minnesota was the Robbinsdale Clinic. And the owner of the clinic was one of my early mentors, and that clinic just closed at the end of December. And, as the owner was going through all of their stuff, wrapping up the clinic and going through all their photographs or whatever, she kept sending me pictures of us in those early years, in the early 90s, of me going to conferences with her, and all of our weird 80s hair, and we had this sort of closure experience, the two of us. And some of the pictures she sent were of clinic invasions and of this day that I remember so poignantly, where protesters smashed the door down. Actually, it was me at the door, smashed the door down, like walked over me and other people, broke into the clinic, locked themselves together with those U-shaped bike locks around their necks, and sat down in front of the procedure rooms and occupied the hallway inside the clinic, and were there for an entire day singing hymns. And we called the police, and the police didn't know what to do and were there. And we actually carried the equipment that we needed to provide abortion care out of the rooms and over this occupation and down the hall, and set up our exam rooms in different parts of the clinic, and saw all the patients that day. And none of the patients rescheduled, because Minnesota's amazing. But she sent me these images, these photographs from those days. And so I actually shared a couple of them with a reporter, just to give them this visual image of what it was like. There's another photo she shared with me of all the protesters laying down in the driveway, and the uncertainty is the thing about terrorism. Like, it's not abstract to me. These people poured propane into the heat intake vent of the clinic. They climbed onto the roof and cut a hole in the ceiling and put a wick with gasoline down the ceiling. I mean, it's amazing this clinic didn't explode with all the things that they tried to do. And those were in the first few years of my career.
I think this is a great time to bring in Dr. Goodwin to the conversation, because you are both all too familiar with the history of violence against providers. So, Dr. Goodwin, can you just talk a little bit about some of those touchstone moments of extremism from the 90s that really led to some protections that we offered through legislation to our providers?
So let's just back up to say that what has been a true failure in terms of narration from every aspect is the extreme violence that's been targeted at providers. Just within the last 50 years, 50 clinic bombings, the murders of doctors, people being killed at their home, at church. People don't even know that the bomber of the Atlanta Olympics also bombed a clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. So people know about the Olympics. They don't know that the same guy murdered the security guard and severely injured staff at Diane Durst's clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. That doesn't even count the arsons that have taken place, setting clinics afire. People don't realize that doctors have had to fly in from out of town, come in through the back doors in the middle of the night, just to be able to avoid the threat that awaits the morning of the services. And then with that, we've not even gotten to what has taken place with patients. So in the 90s, we see a movement where folks are chaining themselves to the doors of clinics. They're literally killing doctors, including at places of worship like churches. They're setting the clinics afire. They're bombing the clinics. Then what we see is the direct targeting of patients, the direct targeting of people who are being bullied and battered and assaulted and spat upon and being shown AK-47s and AR-15s under threat. It's this, and it's this latter part that has become the normalization of getting reproductive health care in the United States. And I say that because many of the places that have provided abortion care also provide contraceptive care. They do breast cancer screenings, maybe doing ovarian screenings, cervical screenings, etc. So if you're just going in to get treated, to get tested in the United States, this is what you can confront just for getting reproductive health care. So the effort has been now through federal legislation to at least have legislation that can be used to protect people when they are getting health care.
And Amy, to your point, so Dr. Goodwin laid out a picture of what happened right in the 90s. And we had federal protections in place called the FACE Act, freedom of access to clinic entrances, which in order to get it passed, they had to also protect churches. And that was a federal law that I'm curious to you, has that law helped you, or has that law, been strangely unenforced or overlooked? How has that made you feel safe up until this point?
I would say it's a both and, right? Like I was talking about before, I started as an abortion provider in Minnesota. And so this weekend was really a full circle on many levels. And I started my first job out of college was in 1989 at the front desk and worked for those first few years in the late 80s, early 90s before FACE. And I was just looking at some pictures from clinic invasions that we had at the clinic I worked at. Once FACE was passed, we didn't see that people successfully necessarily blocking, laying down in the driveway of the clinic, putting nails in the parking lot, occupying the waiting rooms, et cetera. We were able to let local law enforcement know about this federal protections, and it worked to at least sort of deter some people from those clinic blockades and that invasion. This is the but, right? Prosecuting people with FACE was almost impossible in my experience. And, it's been 30 years since that time, and I've managed clinics in multiple places beyond Minnesota since that time. We've turned over hours of tape outside the clinic to law enforcement that shows not only what somebody looks like, that shows their outfit, that shows their license plate, that shows them coming onto the property, climbing over the fence, being onto the roof, pouring something through the ceiling, and they were not held accountable or prosecuted, right? And so actually using the FACE Act to put people in jail has been remarkably difficult. But I would say it has worked in some communities as a deterrent for that physical confrontation at clinics. I think the protesters and the movement pivoted after FACE to use legislative and legal attacks on clinics and on providers and on patients in ways that were less visible to the public. Right? And really chipped away at people's ability to access care and as providers' ability to keep clinics open. But it was much more behind the scenes, and it wasn't observable by the public in some ways. And I wonder sometimes if that is sort of linked to the backlash that really came legislatively with FACE, where people took it seriously and said, hey, you've got to stop these overt attacks on our communities because they were observable by the public.
And what I wanted to go to from here, and this is the part that I think the public doesn't know that I find massively frustrating, is bouncing from what you just said, Amy, how hard it is to get people prosecuted on FACE. Throughout the Biden administration, we had some successes. And so imagine how much information and how much terrorism one had to see on video to get those prosecutions. And I think what the public doesn't know right now is that the Trump administration, during the pardoning of January 6th, nary days after, he pardoned 23 of these violent people, and Pam Bondi, Chip Roy from Texas, Mike Lee, the horrible Mike Lee that we all learned about this week, are trying to repeal this act and probably will be successful. And so I wonder, Amy, and to you, Dr. Goodwin, also, do you think this is just opening up a red carpet for these people to come back and terrorize and harass patients and providers again without very little oversight and very little prosecution?
Absolutely. That is the real reality of what we have on our minds all the time, is that these people are freed. And the through line with terrorism and domestic terrorism, he's freed the January 6th folks, and he's also lauding and praising terrorist tactics in many ways. So now we have, Democratic elected officials in the same category as abortion providers, et cetera, navigating this landscape of domestic terrorism and the uncertainty and the fear, which is what terrorism is, that we're all sort of sharing at this point, unfortunately, is really shining a bright light on what we abortion providers have been navigating in this country for decades.
I think it's important, and that's all powerful in terms of what you've just said, Amy, because what it does, it's that domestic terrorism is like domestic violence itself. For any persons who've experienced it or have friends who have, you know that when the violent person comes home, it's triggering for everybody. It's debilitating. It causes a paralysis. You're triggered. You know that there's nothing that you can do right. And so much of this has been all of that, the psychological terror, the emotional terror, the actual physical terror behind all of this, and where you don't know who in the house tonight is going to get hit. who's going to get slapped. It could be everybody in the house. It could be one person in the house. So in thinking about what took place in Minnesota, who's next? Who else is on the list?
Yeah.
Whose family is on the list? Whose kids are on the list? Amongst my friends who do this do this work, folks who are so afraid about what will happen to their children because they know that this kind of violence doesn't actually love life, love children. I have friends who worry about their pictures or the video of them being shown, speaking at a conference, so that after the conference, their images must be scrubbed because they worry that someone can come to their house and gun down their children, much like what we saw in Minnesota. I want to add, for people who are wondering, well, if there's a law, isn't the law followed? Well, the interesting thing about criminal law and criminal prosecutions, and this is where we see racial disparities and so much, the criminal law is all a matter of discretion. Who do we decide to actually ticket? It doesn't mean everybody's not speeding. It may mean that we just want to give brown people and black people the tickets, white people speeding all the time. Who gets arrested? Well, it turns out if your name is Chad or you're Brad or you're Chip, you get a warning. You don't get arrested. And that's how this goes. Prosecutors have discretion, whether they will actually bring charges or not, so that there can be a law, there can be a state criminal law, there can be a federal law, but it doesn't necessarily mean that prosecutors will decide that we want to enforce it. We want to go after these people. There is discretion. Even after someone may be arrested, prosecutor could decide, well, they've been arrested, but I don't want to prosecute. On the other hand, to bring in this intersection of race within these contexts, on the other hand, what we know of these stories of black and brown people sitting in jail years even, waiting for the charge. What am I actually being charged with? What is it? Because the prosecutors are deciding, well, we don't know. We'll just let you sit there, right? That's how we get to this space that you were talking about, Liz, with Bondi and with Trump saying, letting folks go. And at the same time deciding, okay, we don't have to necessarily enforce the law simply because the law is there.
That's right. And, as of this taping, the gaslighting of finding out that the Supreme Court is going to take up a case to protect fake clinics as they are stripping away from the protections for actual abortion providers. And Michele and Amy both, but Michele, let's start with you first. Can you tell people about this case that we are looking forward to, about the Supreme Court wanting to double down on the protections of these clinics that are literally abortion providing imposters? And that just seems crazy.
This isn't the first iteration, let us say, with what are called crisis pregnancy centers, which got tremendous momentum under the second Bush administration. And even though there have been states that have attempted to regulate in this space, such as California. And so I want to mention, for example, this California case involving what was California's FACT Act, an act that was meant to smoke out these clinics that can even try to parade as abortion clinics, but may not have anybody in them that has any kind of healthcare licensing whatsoever. And so California, years ago, after having a 2-year study on these clinics, wanted to see, well, what is actually happening? And what they learned was that there were these crisis pregnancy centers parading as abortion clinics, where there were people who are not medically licensed, no medical training whatsoever. They were lying to the people who were coming in, claiming that if they had abortions, it was going to cause breast cancer, cervical cancer, and many other things, brain tumors, and any number of things. And so after a 2-year investigation, the state of California passed a law. And in this law, it required that crisis pregnancy centers identify whether there is someone who is medically licensed who is there, and also that they identify that in the state of California, there are reproductive health care services that are provided by the state for people who are of limited means. And this was challenged. And so I mentioned this as a preface. So when we think about this new case coming up before the Supreme Court, given this kind of imprimatur or deference to crisis pregnancy centers, it is not something that is new. And so to your point, while there has been the overturn of Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and the opening of the door to the kind of violence that we see now, is the Supreme Court tipping its hat again in this direction.
It's been 3 years since the overturning of Roe, and part of we knew that was coming. Part of we knew we could plan. We saw them putting trigger laws in place. We saw some things happening. And so talking about that time period between 2022 and the election in 2024, I don't even think that could be interesting, and that's a whole podcast, but let's be honest, how you, Amy, have had to pivot, and I don't think there's a human on the planet that had expectations. And the reason I love talking to you so much is that you are somebody who has the breadth of abortion provision experience of providing in Texas, taking us pre-row through all of that Texas garbage, right? While simultaneously providing care in states like Minnesota and Virginia and New Mexico that had the liberal abortion policies where your Texas patients who have had limited access at points had to go to Minnesota. You're there everywhere, right? So you have the breadth of experience. I wonder if you could tell me in not a TED Talk time, right? What the pivot has felt for you and what your experiences have been over the past, since the inauguration of this person who is hell-bent, his administration is hell-bent on making sure that we can't get the care.
Yeah, I think you're right. I have, been working in Minnesota, Maryland, Virginia, New Mexico at the same time as working in Texas and Indiana, and, for decades. And oftentimes I used to say during our Supreme Court case, Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt, there was a 3-year time period there where I was talking a lot about what it was like to work in what I described as two different Americas, where the actual abortion is the exact same procedure, no matter where you live, the safety of abortion, how the procedure is performed, people's feelings about it, their reactions to it, the patients themselves. It's no different if you live in Maryland or Minnesota or you live in Mississippi or Louisiana. But how people access care, what they have to go through to get that care, the stigma and the shame that they're put through, whether it's in person with protesters or navigating, legislative sort of, battlefields, is night and day different. And I think now what people really see is what I meant and what we're talking about in those two different Americas. It's not just about abortion. It's about pregnancy. It's about healthcare. It's about reproduction. We're seeing outcomes with maternal mortality. We're seeing racial disparities. We're seeing all these different things, right? And now we see politicians targeted in the same way abortion providers have been targeted. And we see it happen in Minnesota, right? And so I think that people are seeing this isn't sort of just in those other places where we don't have to worry about. This is a problem and an issue for our entire country and for all the people who live here. And it's not discriminating about where you live anymore and, where you come from or your ability to pay or whatever. And so I think, unfortunately, we're illustrating this point in the way we're all living in this post-Roe landscape, where people are migrating and traveling if they can for abortion, where people are putting their very lives on the line to get pills to perform an abortion for themselves or their loved ones in places where abortion is so severely restricted. The stories and the experiences that we're seeing across our country right now are incredibly poignant.
And Dr. Goodwin, you have been on the forefront of talking about this drumbeat that we have seen accelerating criminalization. And I say accelerating because your book, Policing the Womb, was released in 2020 through your massive study of research and the racial disparities of how we criminalize not just abortion, but pregnancy as a whole. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, as regular people have gotten touch feels, right, from the legacy media. It's much bigger.
It's so much bigger. And let me just take a pause and say how much I appreciate you, Liz, and the way in which you have devoted this aspect of your life and your journey and your professionalism and all of this to further elevating, because there have been these voids. As you mentioned, my book came out in 2020. It was 10 years in the making. Could have been too, but it was just so much to cover, so much to share, because it was, pardon the French, just a shit show all around, with prosecutors in Alabama, prosecutors in Mississippi, the horrific laws in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And so let me say this, we're living in a really painful echo chamber that we've never fully come to grips with. We've had our moments. And what I'm talking about is a long history of racism. Might we have actually been able to have foreseen, pumped brakes on what was, a powerful and economically flourishing movement, but have we paid attention to racism, right? It might have actually forestalled or even stopped where we are. So we have that long history that nobody recognizes of reproductive sexual assaults and rapes that happen against Black women who were kidnapped from the continent that they were on. And we sort of take that as a normal, natural thing. Like, so what?
It was history.
You're right. It's like history. Breeding wench at 10 to 12 years old. Like that's natural to advertise. Like it's natural that Thomas Jefferson is taking a 13-year-old to Paris with him and she comes back 15 and pregnant and has 6 more of his kids. Like it's totally okay to celebrate that founding father and not use the language of what that is. And we know very well, had that been some Black guy, right, we'd be using so much different terms to describe who he was than founding father, right? And the DNA and all the evidence is all there, right? You have records of Thomas Jefferson writing that he preferred to have girls and women on his plantations because they're turning a profit every year or two. We call that a pimp otherwise, right? But we don't even use the language to recognize what was happening when someone is saying, you're turning a profit for me every year or two, and that's why I prefer to have you around. We call it a brothel, right? Like we don't even use the language. And so then
or pronatalism now. We just say pronatalism and it's the same thing, right? It's like, oh, pushing this narrative. It's kind of wild.
Right. And then this criminalization front in the 80s and the 90s where you have girls like Renee Gibbs, Mississippi, it has a statutory rape law, but this 15-year-old Renee Gibbs, you're going to charge her with depraved heart murder because she has a stillbirth. Well, why is she pregnant in the first place? In a state that says, well, we would recognize this as rape, but not if she's Black. If she's Black, we're going to charge her with depraved heart murder, and then you could just go down the list of so many Black women who were being charged with murder in the 90s for having miscarriages and stillbirths. And it's like crickets. And so when I talk about what could have forestalled at a time in which Roe was the law of the land, at a time in which a person could, terminate a pregnancy, the fact that we've got these prosecutions that are taking place across parts of the United States, where underneath it, you have prosecutors leaning into what is otherwise personhood, right? Like it's because the justification is that somehow what they're doing is avenging the life of this fetus, right? Completely antithetical to what was the reproductive rights movement at the time, but it was a reproductive rights movement that pretty much only saw abortion and was not looking at the myriad other facets of what reproductive health happens to be. And so, fast forward and here we are. And so in the space since Dobbs, as you mentioned, we've seen the prosecutions taking place again for miscarriage, Brittany Watts in Ohio, right? And then you've got lawmakers in Congress saying, well, that really wasn't a prosecution for a miscarriage. That was a prosecution for desecrating a corpse.
Doesn't a corpse have to be a born person before it's a corpse?
So, right. So we're seeing all of these different things right now.
And to say to that, Michele, you wrote about the case in Texas during Roe, right? And 30 states have some kind of law in the books that will negate your health directive if you are a pregnant person. 30 states.
And I wrote about that. That's what I introduce Policing the Womb, is the story that I used to introduce the book, right? But this also goes to your point in terms of mainstream media, being lost, not awake, kind of comatose within the space of all of this.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say, Amy, you have been an abortion provider who has been on the forefront of protecting our rights always. Part of the reason that I started Abortion Access Front was because I wanted to be able to help clinics in some way when they're doing all the things. And you are doing all the things. And we're about to round out and wrap up because this has been a really great conversation about where we're at and where we're going. And I want to talk to you, Amy, first, because you have decided to proactively do what you can legally to protect access to abortion. Tell folks about how you are proactively trying to protect access to abortion, because it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, we're doing lots of things, but one of them is suing the FDA in Virginia. It's a case called Whole Women's Health Alliance versus the FDA, and we are trying to add Virginia, Montana, and Kansas to protections against the federal government sort of further restricting access to mifepristone, and also challenging the restrictions on mifepristone writ large that weren't based on scientific evidence, but are really rooted in politics that restrict people's access to medication abortion nationally. So that would affect people all across the country and hopefully preserve access to mifepristone. We are also preparing a case about Comstock. Hopefully we won't need it, but we are preparing a case just in case the Trump administration and Pam Bondi decide to enforce a law from the 1800s. That has been discussed in Project 2025, and the strategy would be to, close clinics, to restrict abortion even further than they already have. And so we're getting ready for that as well. We're also working on the state level. We are operating clinics in New Mexico, Minnesota, Maryland, and Virginia. And we are working on the state level to protect access to safe abortion in those places, to roll back silly laws that are still on the book in some of those communities, and really from a provider's perspective, not just from a political perspective, but from a provider's perspective, get rid of the restrictions that still remain in some of those communities that make it hard for us to care for as many patients as possible, or make it hard for us to navigate clinics. So like what I'm talking about is like in a blue state like Maryland that everybody talks about as being a real, North Star for abortion access, we still have abortion clinic facility licensing, which has been proven time and time again in many lawsuits, including the whole women's health lawsuit at the Supreme Court, that licensing doesn't add value to the patient's experience. It doesn't increase healthcare outcomes. It's just a burden and a restriction that has no value. And so we want to roll back those things like waiting periods or restrictions for young people's access to abortion that's still on the books in Virginia, et cetera. So trying to clean up those things as well at the state level.
Well, and I love that you're always innovating. As I said at the top of the show, and I'll reveal now, I'm also on the board of Whole Women's Health Alliance. And one of the things that I really appreciate so much, and I feel like people need to follow your leadership on, is taking a page from the playbook that this anti-abortion movement has set forever. They set so many things. They looked at every possible scenario, and they looked at and they looked at pushing every political way forward for themselves so that they would have their ducks set up. And so for you to say, you know what? I want to set up every duck in a row I can to protect how I can, and also look to the future of what do we already have in place if we have friendlier political administrations happening, so we don't have to spend our time crafting. We have our ducks in a row to do that. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that.
One of the things I think I've learned, it's a tough lesson to have learned, but I've learned over time, is that oftentimes anti-abortion folks know more about how abortion clinics operate and about how we deliver care than the sort of advocates in the pro-choice movement. So they understand how to write legislation and how to restrict access to abortion because they know all about how the clinic operations work. They understand hallway widths and, sort of like ways to make it difficult for us to stay open. And oftentimes people in our movement don't understand that. They don't center the actual service delivery of abortion care as a value that's really important to center in the movement. We get sort of stuck in the politics sometimes. And so, you see laws written that really reveal, right, that people like Jonathan Mitchell and all these other bad guys have really paid attention to the care infrastructure and understand what the pressure points are, not only for providers, but for people trying to access safe abortion care in our communities.
Yeah. And as we've even watched people take the language from the anti-abortion movement, because the wider scope of media and even our own movement has not centered people, when they don't center our humanity, and that's the language with which you take, then we as advocates in turn also don't center the humanity of the providers. And I think it's the way we win,
Right.
Dr. Goodwin, do you have anything to add about what we should be looking towards as we face the end of 2025 into 2026?
Yes. So it is a firestorm that is causing a paralysis around. There's just so much, all of the executive orders, the political violence, all of that. And it can really cause any group, any peoples to go off their game. And so I think that we need to continue thinking about what our North Star is, what should be What's the kind of future that we want? Because with the political violence and everything else that we're seeing, it's enough to make anybody want to just pull the sheets over their head and just say enough, right? But we do have to fight back. We've got to think back. We've got to think about what kind of future, what is our reproductive New Deal that we want going forward so that it can be articulated and then we've got it ready and we can charge ahead.
Well, I think following the work of you, Dr. Goodwin and Amy, and hopefully Abortion Access Front, we'll be able to provide some of those guideposts. So thank you both so much for joining us today. I can't think of two better people to talk to on this anniversary about where we are at.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you again to Dr. Michele Goodwin and to Amy Hagstrom Miller. We'll put links to how you can follow and support their work in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening. I think this episode was super important, not only to give you the stark realities of where we're at and where we're heading when it comes to accessing and protecting abortion care. And we're not going to leave you hanging with a little bit of a dark cloud. We have action items for you. That's right. We are going to be doing a brand new Operation Save Abortion event that will be live streamed from Netroots Nation Saturday, August 9th, 12:30 to 2 p.m. If you want to participate, just go to aafront.org/opsave-netroots. If you don't know about our Operation Save Abortion trainings, they're incredible interactive activist workshops and conversations. This one is hosted by Moji and I and our programs team at AAF, and we will be not only talking about but teaching you how to execute 3 different action items that Abortion Access Front does on the reg. One that supports abortion patients and providers, one that helps expose fake clinics, and one that will help you take your grievances hilariously and poignantly directly to the politicians passing these laws. You'll be able to ask questions in real time about anything you don't understand about the actions and walk away with new ways to get involved, along with detailed toolkits to help you execute them all. So we recommend gather a bunch of friends to watch this incredible event, as we always like to create programs that are most rewarding to do with your activist besties. Or better yet, come join us at Netroots Nation live and participate with us right there. Again, the dates, August 7th through 9th in New Orleans. If you don't know about Netroots, it's like the Comic-Con of progressive politics. Amazing politicians, activists, and nonprofits throw workshops, trainings, and discussions, all that keep you up to date and keep you activated as to what is happening in our world, all kinds of ways that you can plug in. Look, we all want to be the change that we want to see in the world, so why not get the skills to do so? Plus, 2025 marks the 20th anniversary of Netroots. So come join your Buzzkills for the live workshops and a weekend with like-minded folks giving us all kinds of information and tools. If you're interested in coming in person, go to netrootsnation.org for all the specifics, on how to buy a ticket, the full agenda, Plus, there's a Buzzkills discount. Just enter the code Buzzkills to get 10% off on the price of your ticket. Hotel blocks. They've got discounted hotel blocks. So go to netrootsnation.org to register. And so we know you're coming. You can see us at the booth. You can come. We'll hang out. So on this third anniversary of the loss of Roe v. Wade, we remind you, persevere, stand up, fight back. Don't let the fuckheads win.
Feminist Buzzkill, the podcast. Feminist Buzzkill, the podcast from Abortion Access Front. New episodes drop Friday. When BS is poppin', we pop off. And if you want to support our podcast and all the work of Abortion Access Front, like, subscribe, and join our Patreon at patreon.com/feministbuzzkills.